Hello everyone, today we're exploring the Reti Endgame idea. We're going to be looking at this through 4 examples that you see on your screen right now. They are all really interesting because the Reti idea is really interesting, so let's jump straight in. Now, the basic idea, which was actually created by Richard Reti in this position right here, is the following. Many times in pawn endgames, you have 2 things that you want to do almost simultaneously. So here is black. Notice the pawn is going up for white. This one is going down. White really has 2 major ideas they could consider doing. They can either go down and aim to defend by taking this pawn, or they can go for the offensive by going to the left and supporting this pawn, because it's very clear to see this pawn cannot independently promote. So those are your 2 options. You can either commit your time and energy by supporting this pawn, or commit your time and energy by going after this pawn. So you have these 2 ideas, but what you very quickly notice is that you can't do either of these ideas alone. This is what I mean. If you focus only on taking this pawn, that doesn't matter. Their pawn is very quick enough, far quicker than your king, and you're just going to be following behind, and eventually it's going to promote into a queen and win the game from there. Now, similarly, if your only priority, if your only idea is to support this pawn, that doesn't do anything either, because their king will be able to take this pawn. They could push first, but ultimately their king comes here and just takes the pawn. You're not quick enough. What you need to do is find a way to support both of your ideas simultaneously. This is the Reti idea. You go king to g7. The nice thing about chess is that going along the diagonal takes the same amount of time as it would going down the board and to the left. And so that means that when you go to this square, you have not only gone a little bit down the board, a little bit threatening to take this pawn, but you've simultaneously gone a little bit to the left, a little bit threatening to support this pawn. Whereas before, you were independently going for this pawn, not going down, and similarly independently going for this pawn, not going for the left. So now you're doing both things, and this makes all the difference because, okay, if they just continue pushing their pawn, you continue on the same track of going down and going left. If they continue pushing the pawn, at some point, you just say, okay, I've made enough leftward progress, I can abort this idea of going for the pawn, and you just go and promote your pawn. And again, your king is close enough that it can support the pawn's promotion, and the game will end with a draw. Now, similarly, if instead of pushing their pawn, let's say they prioritize taking your pawn, well, you continue coming here. And if they take the pawn, you've made enough downward progress to target their only pawn. There are a couple of other options. They could first push the pawn, you continue here, and then they go for this one. But same basic idea. You go king e5, doing 2 things at once, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. And if they take the pawn, you go and take this pawn, you're quick enough. And if they push the pawn, you retreat and you go and promote your pawn, you're quick enough. Now, this was very theoretical. It was a very interesting position to get. So what Reti then did is he created a full endgame around it. So look at this position. It's really cute because after king to g6 and king to b6, white can take the pawn on g7. And you might be wondering how. Well, the idea is that if they push h5, we have the same exact position we just saw with the Reti idea. We go here along the diagonal doing 2 things, hitting this pawn, supporting this pawn, and again, we've seen this king e5, and if they push, we abort and support our pawn. If they take, we come down and take the pawn. So a nice application of this concept. By the way, if they were to push instead the f-pawn, we still go king f6, and we're still doing 2 things at once. You're attacking the pawn, you're also getting closer to supporting the pawn. So something like this, king e5, and you can come back and promote. And again, something like if they take the pawn, you take, and you're quick enough to take and pick up this h-pawn as well. So this is kind of Reti's contribution to the endgame scene, but then it was applied in real game examples many times. We'll take a look at 2 of these applications. So in this position, it is black to play. And here, the thing to understand is, again, you have 2 ideas. The pawn going down the board, you want to promote it. It obviously cannot promote itself right now, the king is too close. But also you need to be careful because this pawn here is running up the board. And so if in this position, you went king a2, and your idea is to support this pawn, for example, if they push, perfect. You go a3, you support the pawn, then you can move, then you can push. You're actually promoting first, and therefore you're going to be able to win because you're picking off the queen because of the specific placement of the pieces. The issue though, they're just going to take your pawn, and now you haven't made the horizontal progress necessary to pick up this pawn, and they're just going to be able to push. If you consider the square that we've previously talked about, the king is not in the square, it is too far behind, and that becomes really clear when you look at the line and black loses. So what you need to do, similarly, by the way, I should note king to c2 here, going only for the pawn loses because they can push. And now you aren't able to go a3 either. So that's the idea. So you do two things at once again. You go king b2, making a little progress up the board, but not conceding by going to the left and aborting the closeness that you maintain, the proximity to this pawn on the f-file. So now if they take your pawn, you're quick enough to go king c3 and you're in the square and you can stop the pawn. And similarly, if instead of taking the pawn, they go for f4, you're quick enough to go a3, and again, you're promoting. And in fact, once again, as you'll see, you end up winning. So a very nice application of the Reti idea, which takes us to the final position. And ladies and gentlemen, it's the same exact idea. Here as white, the move is h4, you're pushing the pawn up the board. And the idea is this, they're gonna go king to g4, hitting the pawn. Now, the most natural move here, okay, let's get the king into the action where the board is going on, because you can't push the pawn, obviously, it's too far down the board. So king f6. However, the issue is they can go c4. And after you take, they can do a pawn breakthrough. That's another concept we've very much talked about. And once again, with the rule of the square, the king is blocked, right? So we saw this example in that video as well. The king cannot access the closest, the quickest path, and black ends up winning. So king f6 here does not work. What you do is you go king g6. Because now you're putting pressure on black. They no longer can go for this pawn breakthrough, which otherwise would work, because now you're also with king g6 threatening to just push h5. And suddenly your pawn is running up, and you're going to be able to get counterplay and draw the position. Now after king g6, you're forcing them therefore to take the pawn off the board. But now you've made that one critical difference. The king is one square further down, and after king f5, because of the Reti's idea, your king is definitely close enough. And similarly, if they try this idea of going for the breakthrough, they are nowhere near close enough to make that happen on the board, because your king indeed wraps around and takes the pawn. So a very useful idea, the Reti's idea, which, you know, depending on the specifics of the position could mean a couple different things. But if we're just talking about this from a philosophical basis, all you need to consider is this. There are two things you want to do. Don't concede, prioritizing only one of those while neglecting to do the other. Do both at the same time, because you need to recognize that the geometry of how the board is set up allows you to not waste any time by going on the diagonals. You're still making the down and the horizontal progress that you need to make, and you're going to be able to do two things at once. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you're new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.